She said it so fast, I almost missed it. Standing in the doorway of a coffee shop she'd never been to, holding a baby who wasn't crying, but should have been, given how tired her mother looked. Can you be the father of my baby for one day? I stared at her. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't joking. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had already rehearsed this 10 times in her car before walking in. I said the only thing that made sense. Only if you tell me why. She didn't answer right away. She just sat down across from me, set the baby carrier on the table between us like it was evidence, and said, then we're going to need more than one coffee. This is that story. My name is Daniel. I was 34, recently laid off from an engineering firm, and spending most of my mornings at Marlowe's, a small cafe 2 blocks from my apartment, mostly because it was quiet and the owner didn't mind if I nursed one drip coffee for 3 hours while I pretended to be job hunting on my laptop. I'd seen her before. Twice, maybe 3 times. Always alone, always with the baby, always sitting near the window like she was watching for someone who never came. Her name, I would learn, was Sara, 29. A nurse's aide at a hospice facility across town. The baby, 6 months old, was named Ren. That Tuesday, she didn't sit near the window. She walked straight to my table, like she'd made a decision on the sidewalk and was afraid that if she paused, she'd lose her nerve. I know this is insane, she said. I know I don't know you. But I've watched you sit here for 3 weeks and you always let the barista keep the change. And once you gave your seat to an old man without being asked. And I need someone who is at least a decent stranger, because I don't have a decent person I can ask who isn't a stranger. I asked her to slow down. She told me about her grandmother, Ruth, 81 years old in the final stage of a long illness, currently a patient in the same hospice where Sara worked, which she said was its own special kind of unbearable, watching your grandmother's chart from both sides of the desk. Ruth had one wish that she talked about more than anything else, to meet Ren's father before she passed, not because she needed to approve of him, because Ruth had raised Sara after Sara's own parents left when Sara was 9, and Ruth had spent her whole life believing that a baby without an involved father was a broken promise happening again in the family 1 generation later. Sara had never told her the truth, that Ren's biological father, a man named Tomas, had left the state 4 months before Ren was born and had not called since. She keeps saying, before I go, I want to see him hold her, just once. Just so I know she's not starting out the way I did, Sara said. She has maybe 2 weeks left, maybe less. I've lied to her for 6 months about a work trip, a delay, bad phone service. I'm out of lies. I asked the obvious question. Why not just tell her the truth? Sara's jaw tightened. Because the truth will not give her peace. It'll give her one more thing to grieve on her way out, and she's already grieving everything. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it because a lie that lets someone die peacefully isn't the same kind of lie as one that hurts them. I didn't have a comeback for that. I still don't, if I'm honest. One day, she said. One visit. You hold Ren, you let her see the 3 of us together, you say maybe 6 sentences the whole time, and then you disappear, and I owe you nothing except however much money you want, which, I'll be honest, isn't much, because nursing aid pay is a joke. I told her I didn't want her money. Then why would you do it? I haven't said I would, I said. I said I'd hear why. You told me why. Now I need to think about whether why is enough. I went home that night and did what any reasonable person does when handed an insane request from a stranger. I made a list of every reason to say no. I didn't know this woman. I didn't know if the story was even true. For all I knew, dying grandmother was a script she used on men at coffee shops, though even as I wrote that down I felt guilty, because nobody fakes the specific exhaustion I'd seen in her face. I didn't know what I'd be agreeing to beyond one day. Contracts have exit clauses. This didn't. I didn't know Ren, and something about holding someone else's baby and pretending to a dying woman that the baby was mine felt like it crossed a line I couldn't fully name yet, but I also wrote down the other side. I had, 3 weeks earlier, sat in this same apartment doing nothing useful for anyone, including myself. I had been laid off from a job I didn't love, from a company that didn't notice I was gone, and the loudest feeling I had most days was the feeling of being unnecessary. Here was a woman offering me one very specific, very finite way to matter to someone, for one day, at real emotional cost to myself and real emotional benefit to a woman I'd never met. I called Sara the next morning. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been staring at her phone. I have 3 conditions, I said. Okay. First, I want to actually meet her, your grandmother, before the day it matters, so I'm not learning her name in real time in front of her deathbed. That's fair. Actually, that's better than fair. That's more thought than I expected. Second, Ren doesn't get handed to a stranger without you right next to me the entire time. I don't want to hold a baby I don't know without her mother an arm's length away. Sara exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since the coffee shop. Obviously. Yes. Third, and this one's not negotiable. When this is over, whatever happens with your grandmother, you tell Ren the truth someday. Not the whole ugly story, not necessarily soon, but someday, when she's old enough. I'm not going to be a permanent lie in a kid's life. I'll help you protect your grandmother from a truth that would only hurt her on her way out. I won't help you build a wall around Ren forever. There was a long pause. Okay, Sara said, quieter now. Someday, I promise. That was how it started. Not a favor, not quite a friendship, something in between that didn't have a name yet. We met the following Sunday, in a sunlit room at Brookhaven Hospice that smelled like lavender hand lotion and something medical underneath it that no amount of lavender could fully cover. Ruth was smaller than I expected. Most people are, I've since learned, once illness has had enough time with them, but her eyes were sharp in a way that made me instantly nervous, like she could tell I was rehearsed. Sara introduced me exactly as we'd planned. Grandma, this is Daniel. Ruth studied me for a long moment. You're late by about 7 months, young man. My heart stopped. Sara's hand found the small of my back, steadying or maybe steadying herself. Work took me overseas longer than I wanted, I said, which was the story, delivered exactly as rehearsed and which felt like swallowing a stone. I should have called more. I know that. Ruth kept looking at me. Then unexpectedly, her face softened. Well, you're here now. That's more than her own father ever managed, and he had considerably less excuse. I understood then that Ruth wasn't just grieving her own death. She was trying, with what time she had left, to close a door that had been open and hurting in her family for 2 generations, the door of men who didn't show up. She needed to believe, before she went, that the door was finally shut. Sara put Ren in my arms for the first time that day. I want to be honest about what that felt like because it's the part of the story people ask about most. It did not feel like acting. Ren looked up at me with the specific, unbothered trust that only babies have. No memory of my absence, no grievance, no test to pass, and something in my chest rearranged itself. Ruth watched us for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Bring her closer. Let me see her father's hands." I held Ren's small hand up next to mine. Ruth touched both of them. "Good," she whispered. "Good. That's a father's hands." "Sara, you did better than I feared." Sara's eyes were wet. I didn't look at her, because I was afraid if I did, mine would be too. We stayed 2 hours. Ruth talked about Sara as a girl, about a swing set Sara's grandfather had built with his own hands before he passed, about a version of family that had clearly been imperfect and clearly, still, deeply loved. I said very little. I mostly listened and held Ren and let a dying woman have the one thing she'd asked the universe for. When we left, Sara didn't speak until we were in the parking lot. Then she turned to me and said, "Thank you," in a voice that had nothing left to spare for anything more than those 2 words. I told her I'd see her at the next visit. Here is the part of the story that surprised both of us. One day became 4 visits over the next 2.5 weeks because Ruth kept asking when we were coming back, and neither Sara nor I had the heart to give her less time with her granddaughter's family than she wanted and what both of us understood. Without saying it aloud, were her final days. Somewhere in those visits, the arrangement between Sara and me stopped feeling transactional. I started coming early to help her get Ren ready. Car seat buckles are not designed by people who have ever actually held a crying infant with one arm. I learned that Sara took her coffee with too much sugar and always apologized for it, as if sugar were a moral failing. I learned that she'd been accepted to a nursing program twice and deferred it twice, once for Ruth's declining health and once, years earlier, for Tomas, a decision she talked about with a flatness that told me she'd made peace with regretting it. She learned things about me too. That I wasn't actually job hunting most mornings at Marlowe's. I was avoiding calling my father. who'd wanted me to take over his hardware store and had taken my engineering degree somewhat personally. That I gave up my seat to strangers not out of saintliness, but because my mother had drilled it into me as a kid, and I'd never examined the habit, just kept doing it. On the third visit, in the hospital parking lot, Sara said something that changed the shape of the whole story. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not read into it wrong." I told her to go ahead. "I don't need you to keep doing this," she said. "Ruth has her piece. I could tell her you got transferred back overseas or something, and let this end cleanly like we planned. You've more than done what I asked, but I don't want you to stop. And I don't know if that's because Ren has started reaching for you when you walk in, or because I've started looking forward to Tuesdays for reasons that have nothing to do with my grandmother, and I need to say that honestly before this goes one more visit." I didn't answer with words at first. I reached over and took her hand, the same way I'd held Ren's hand up for Ruth to touch. Except this time there was no audience, no performance, nothing to prove to anyone. "I wasn't doing this because I felt sorry for you," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I kept coming back because somewhere around visit 2, I stopped counting." Ruth passed on a Thursday morning, 11 days after that conversation in the parking lot. Sara called me at 6:14 a.m., and I was in my car in under 10 minutes. I want to tell you the part of this story that neither Sara nor I saw coming, because it's the part that made me understand what this whole strange arrangement had actually been. 2 days before she died, when it was just Ruth and Sara in the room, and Sara believed her grandmother was mostly sleeping, Ruth had opened her eyes and said, without any preamble, "You know he's not really Ren's father." Sara told me later that her whole body had gone cold. "I've watched 100 families walk through that door in 20 years of nursing," Ruth had said. "I know real fear in a young man's eyes, and I know borrowed love when I see it. That man loves your daughter. I could see it by the second visit. But he did not make her, and you did not marry him, and neither one of you is quite as clever as you think." Sara had started to apologize, started to explain, and Ruth had waved a thin hand at her, cutting her off. "Don't. I let you have your lie because I needed my own kind of peace as much as you thought I did. I needed to believe this family could still produce a man who shows up, even if I had to squint to see it clean. And do you know what I found instead? Something better than what I asked for. I found a man who chose to show up for a child that isn't his, for a woman he barely knew, because it was the right thing and not because any blood or vow made him do it. That is worth more to me than the lie you told, Sara, not less. More." She died 2 days later with Sara's hand in hers, Ren asleep in a bassinet in the corner, and this detail still undoes me every time. My name apparently among the last few words she said clearly when she told the hospice chaplain that her great-granddaughter had a good father, whatever the paperwork says. The funeral was small. I stood beside Sara, not in front, not performing anything for anyone, because there was no longer anyone left who needed the performance. Ruth had known the truth and had, in her own unsentimental way, blessed it anyway. In the months after, Sara and I didn't rush anything, because both of us had learned the hard way what happens when people build a life on top of an unexamined story. We dated slowly. I met Ren not as a man playing a part, but as a man choosing, day by day, whether he wanted to keep showing up. And every day, the answer was yes. 8 months after that first conversation in Marlowe's, Sara finally enrolled in the nursing program she'd deferred twice. I watched Ren 2 evenings a week while she attended night classes, and somewhere in there I stopped thinking of it as watching Sara's daughter and started simply thinking of it as my Tuesdays and Thursdays with my daughter, because that is, in every way that has ever mattered, what she'd become. We never told Ren a dramatic version of any of this, but Sara kept her promise. When Ren was 7 and asked, the way kids eventually do, whether Daddy was her real father, Sara told her the truth in the gentlest way a truth like that can be told. That her body came from someone who left before she was born, but her father, the one who showed up for every fever, every school play, every scraped knee, chose her, on purpose, more than once, starting from a day when she was 6 months old and couldn't even hold her own head up. Ren, 7 years old and entirely unbothered by nuance, reportedly said, "Okay, can we get ice cream?" Kids, it turns out, understand the important part faster than adults do. People ask me sometimes, usually after a few drinks, whether I regret saying yes to a stranger's insane request in a coffee shop. I tell them the truth. I almost said no. I had every reasonable argument lined up. What tipped me over wasn't sympathy, and it wasn't romance, not yet. It was one sentence Sarah said before I'd made up my mind, one I haven't forgotten since. She said, "I'm not asking you to be her father. I'm asking you to be one day of proof that a good man exists, because that's the only gift I have left to give my grandmother." I said yes because I wanted for one day to be that proof. I stayed because one day was never going to be enough. If you've made it this far, if a story like this has ever made you believe that showing up, even once, even imperfectly, even for someone you barely know, can rearrange the whole shape of a life, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe because Sarah, Ren, and I still have plenty of Tuesdays left to tell you about.